This week, we're talking to Ian Amit, the Chief Security Officer for Cimpress. We're going to talk about risk metrics, and how to use risk metrics to bring value to your security program. Plus, probably we'll stray into a few other areas. We're devoting both segments of the show today to our conversation with Ian, so join us as we tear down silos and build bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. Today's organizations face an evolving set of security threats and continually changing compliance requirements. As your business grows, privacy concerns only multiply and add to a dynamic set of priorities. Today's organizations need to integrate risk, security, and privacy into a cohesive program. Online Business Systems team of seasoned security practitioners work closely with you to assess your security posture, policies, procedures, and technologies, providing tailored solutions that are specifically aligned to your business's risk profile and ultimately ensure the protection of your brand. To learn more about Online Business Systems, go to securityweekly.com/online.
Welcome to episode 12 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded on January 7th in the new year 2020. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, coming to you from used to be sunny a minute ago, but we're getting ready to get some snow, Pasadena, Maryland. And joined with me today, my other hosts, all remote, Mr. Matt Alderman, Mr. Scott Lyons, and Mr. Josh Marpet. Welcome, gentlemen.
Happy New Year, all.
Happy New Year. It's good to be back.
Happy New Year. Happy new decade. Lots of excitement to look forward to.
Next year.
Before we jump in, I got a couple quick announcements. Security Weekly, since it's the new year, we're going to get on the road here pretty quickly. RSA Conference 2020 coming up the end of February 24th to 28th. Please join us and thousands of other security professionals, forward-thinking innovators, and solution providers for 5 days of actionable learning, inspiring conversation, and breakthrough ideas. Register before January 24th and save $900 off a full conference pass. And you can save an extra $150 by going to securityweekly.com/RSAC 2020 and use our code to register. Also, as long as we're on the road, we're going to hit InfoSec World 2020, which comes up at the end of March, actually March 30th through April 1st, down at the Disney Contemporary Resort in Orlando. Again, Security Weekly listeners can save 15% off the InfoSec World, either the main conference or the World Pass. All you got to do to take advantage of the discount is to go to securityweekly.com/ISW 2020, click the registration button, and use our discount code. Okay, enough of that. Our first guest in the new year and the new decade of 2020 is Mr. Ian Amit. He is currently the Chief Security Officer for a company called Cimpress. Ian likes to talk about risk management, and we were wondering initially, what does that possibly have to do with security and compliance? I think risk came up in our discussion several episodes ago, probably most of our episodes, and I think it was Josh that suggested, hey, let's get Ian on the show. So Ian, welcome to Security and Compliance Weekly.
Thank you so much. Great being here.
Hey, just to start off, can you give us a little bit of your background? What do you do? What are you doing? What are you planning on doing? Past, present, future?
Absolutely. So first of all, I mostly like to practice risk and security rather than talk about it. But when I have to talk about it, I try to do my best. I'm currently, as you mentioned, the Chief Security Officer for Cimpress, and most people are probably more familiar with one of our businesses under the Cimpress umbrella, which is Vistaprint. That's one of the 16 businesses that we operate globally. Prior to my role there as CSO, I've been working at Amazon, both on the AWS side as well as the retail side. I have a history with IOActive, with ZeroFox, with other security vendors, and a very, very long-standing experience as a red teamer and pen tester and consultant through most of my career. So kind of transitioned from the aggressor, pen tester, hacker, red teamer side of things through the vendor side, building products and helping build security for my customers, and ended up completely on the blue team side.
Great. Hey, a question that we like to sort of ask all of our guests to sort of level set. There's no right answer. We're just trying to get a read on where you are. Since this show is focused on security versus, security and compliance, and in at least the security hacker side of things, it's very often comes across as adversarial. We simply like to ask, where do you fall in the whole security versus compliance spectrum? What's your take on that?
My personal take is that you should do security properly, and if you do it correctly, compliance will be a good derivative of your security program. I'm not a big fan of using compliance as a driver for security. However, I do understand that for some organizations, based on their where they are as far as their security maturity, security program maturity, sometimes they need to hang on to compliance as the first step. And in those cases, I see it as highly justified to use that as a stepping stone. But my view is that people need to remember that this is not the goal. This is just a step in the way for a proper security program.
Great. And then, of course, you're coming in to talk to us or to facilitate a discussion on risk. Just starting out, where does risk fall into the spectrum of security versus compliance, or is it a part or at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely see risk as a core component of a security program. In my view, if you look at security merely from a technical perspective, you're doing a disservice to the organization you're trying to protect. Every security professional employed in a defensive capability needs to take risk into account. And risk comes to play when you put the technical elements in a business context. So that's where risk is actually applied when you look at the different threat models, at the adversaries that you need to deal with, at the business environment, at other elements that might impact your operations. This is where risk comes into play. And in my mind, risk is a main driver for the security program and enables us as security professionals to identify areas where we need to apply more focus, and adversely identify areas where we can kind of take the foot off the gas, because there's less sensitivity or there's less need for tightening controls or heightening security in those areas. So that's kind of the nice play that I think that exists between risk in general and security in a more specific context.
Hey, a quick sort of level setting question. On our show so far, we've had many episodes, and it'll be an ongoing discussion of, sort of defining what we mean when we talk about security and compliance. And I don't want to drum that up because that's sort of an ongoing discussion. But just to level set for our listening audience and to facilitate our discussion, could you give us a short definition, at least, of how you view or define risk? What is risk in this context?
In that context, risk, I'll start with a final result. For me, risk needs to translate into monetary value. What is the chance? What is the probability of an adverse event happening, resulting in financial loss? That's the bottom line. From there on, you can develop it in different ways. There are different frameworks to express that. different kind of formulas to figure that out. But that at the end of the day, it's having an actor of some kind, and it could be a natural event as well, having an effect on your organization that results in some kind of loss. And for me, the best way to measure loss is typically financial, because that's also something that we can use to kind of calibrate how sensitive are we as an organization to this kind of loss, to this magnitude of loss, and what kind of resources do we want to put in to minimizing or having an effect on the magnitude of that loss in dollars.
So Ian,
Okay.
what I'm hearing is you want to focus on more of the quantitative aspects of risk versus the qualitative aspects, right? By quantifying it to $1 and $1 loss amount, that's how you try to associate risk, because there are models out there that look at the qualitative aspects of risk, high, medium, low, et cetera.
Sure.
You prefer not to use the qualitative side?
That's correct. That's correct. I found that when we as security professionals have a place have a seat at the board level discussion, high, medium, low tends to look amateurish or childish. I call it paint by numbers. You're trying to sit down with people who speak mostly financial, and you're coming up with colors or levels, and you can't really back it up. So I found it to be very effective when discussing risk with other professionals coming from other fields that are not security related, mostly financial, operational. So having that common language, which is the quantitative element in dollars, is pretty beneficial, at least in my experience.
Yeah,
which
talk
means
apples to apples, if you will, is incredibly useful. Yeah, if you can speak dollars to the financial people, geeks understand dollars because that's what buys them equipment, right?
Yep.
And the business people get dollars. It's an apples to apples comparison. That totally makes sense.
True, but it's also a hard number to get to, right? There's been a number of value at risk kind of formulas out there, Ian. I'm curious kind of the different frameworks that really allow you to do in an easy or accurate way, I should say, of calculating that value at risk, right? What is that dollar value that you apply to these different metrics that you're calculating?
And I think you've hit it right on the head in terms of that. That's the biggest challenge I think that we have in quantifying risk. As you mentioned, there are a few frameworks. There's been multiple attempts in the past to provide a dollar value to something. You and I and everyone here and our listeners have probably ran across varying estimations of how much does a data breach cost, how much does a data point cost an organization, and I'm sure we've all seen numbers that range from the single dollars to hundreds of dollars per record. So obviously that is an incorrect science, and that's probably one of the biggest risks that we have, pun intended, the biggest risks, is what framework do we use and how can we back up our estimations, and how can we provide a calibration of how accurate are we in estimating the risk. So the bottom line is that there is no, this is not an exact science. We're all relying on statistical models. We're all relying on estimations, on forecasting. I think that what matters to a good framework is the ability to defend itself, to be repeatable, so that if you're running the same scenario in multiple times or running similar scenarios on different organizations, you can have a repeatable model that looks the same across the board. You can have a defensible model where the business owners can relate to the numbers, especially when we're talking about the losses element. So at the end of the day, it's not even a tool that's solely used by us, a security professional. It's a framework that we use, or at least that I use, to speak with the business and have them engaged. I can tell you that one of the tricks that I've found working with risk frameworks, and I personally like FAIR because I'm, as kind of my hacker mindset gets very at home with that framework. But a trick that I found is providing challenging numbers and saying, look, I don't really know, what does this event looks like, or what does the loss here quantifies at, what's the dollar value, but I've estimated at X. And usually that X is an egregious number. It's like way beyond the actual losses. And typically it entices the other side, the business side, the CFO, the COO, whoever it is, to jump out of their seat and say, no, that's out of whack. And my immediate response is, okay, you're the expert. You tell me what's the number. As long as the numbers that are being plugged in from the business side make sense to them, they're basically signing off of them. And then once you have that into the framework, and the framework itself is defensible and repeatable, you get into a point where the accuracy makes sense, or at least is calibrated to a degree that all sides feel comfortable and can rely on those numbers.
So social engineering them to get them to provide numbers is okay, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. Social engineering is okay in general. It's a life skill.
So besides the framework, which I love the explanation of how you take a framework and tie it into risk. Love it. Absolutely love it. Where does somebody start with being able to say, okay, this is exactly where in the network we need to define the most risky point at, right? Where does somebody look in their network to start with systems and engineering and enterprise to work through those models and define risk amounts?
That's a great question. I actually don't have a finite answer to that. Every organization, every network is different. I can tell you that what we've been doing at Cimpress is using two different approaches to tackle that point. We're using a very tactical one that is driven by a qualitative framework from NIST, NIST CSF, to provide a basic mapping of maturity models. And using that, you can quickly identify areas where you have the least maturity and kind of focus on that and at least figure out, am I comfortable having this level of maturity in those areas? Now, again, that's a very tactical approach. Call it semi-technical. We're combining that with the more risk-driven approach, whereas we're not even asking where in the network should we focus on. We're asking the business to tell us what are their top 3, 5, 10 loss scenarios from a business perspective. And we're pushing them to portray those scenarios. Again, the focus is that these are business scenarios. And we're pushing them to not to appease us as security professionals, as techies. So if they start saying data breach or hackers, I was like, no, that's not a business loss scenario. So we're forcing them to walk through an actual scenario that they are, and that's their job. I mean, if you talk to a CEO, to a CFO, COO, they know this. They know what's the competitive landscape. They know what they're trying to defend. They know what's driving their business. So they'll be able to tell you, or at least create a short list of scenarios that they care the most about. And then it's a matter of kind of reverse engineering that scenario into the relevant components that we have an effect on. So back to your question, from that scenario, you can start identifying servers, assets, networks in a technical perspective. Yeah. And that enables you to say, you know what, this is an area I want to focus on. This is an area that if I invest in, going back to the numbers game, if I invest X number of dollars and improve the security maturity there or improve the controls, it will have an effect on the overall scenario. And the impact is going to be a reduction of Y dollars in expected losses. And then it becomes a game of, simply a game of accounting. How much are you willing to invest and what's going to be the impact on it?
Wait. So you're saying,
Ian, I've got
go ahead, Josh.
I got a question for you. You mentioned
Sure.
the business scenarios that you ask these executives and management to create, business law scenarios. Sorry. I've got to ask a question. How often do you find them thinking either too short term or too long term? How
Great
often
question.
do you find them thinking in different time scales or different horizons, thresholds, whatever, that you never ever thought of, or you're like, why are you thinking so short term, or something like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I know where you're driving into. To be honest, I think that by focusing on kind of the top 5, 10 law scenarios, you're going to get a bit of both. You're going to get both very short term, like this is happening right now, or this is, we're looking at the next step kind of scenario, because there's the new law, there's an M&A, whatever it is, as well as very, very long term, like the market is going there.
Yeah, exactly.
Geopolitical situations. So I can tell you that I've had things from, changing technology, like we're changing a technology, and that's a very short-term risk or very short-term scenario that we're looking at that might have a loss associated with it, as well as, last year, some of the loss scenarios that I dealt with was Brexit. How do you quantify that? By the way, there is no answer to it, as we keep saying. But this, you'll get a bit of both very long-term, amorphic scenarios and very short-term ones. And I think that's a huge advantage for us, because it gives us better visibility into kind of the mind of a CEO. How does a business executive think, and what kind of challenges do they face? And it enables us to be able to figure out, where can I plug in? Where can I help? And, in some situations, I'm going to be probably second, third tier support over that scenario. I have no immediate material impact on it, but I can try to figure out what are the kind of ripple effects that may happen from that scenario, and try to see where do I fit in there. Does that make sense?
Actually, yes, it does. It makes sense. I was asking, we often see CEOs do very long-term vision, and management do very short-term or tactical. So it's curiosity's sake about that, but I like your answer. That's great. We've got a question here about, we've been jumping into NIST CSF and FAIR. We've talked about NIST CSF before. We haven't really talked about FAIR before. Can I ask you to sort of describe FAIR in sort of overview terms, to discuss and give people an idea of what it is and what it's used for?
Sure, absolutely. Again, there are better professionals than myself to describe FAIR, but I would describe it as a framework for quantifying risk in monetary terms, whereas risks are taken as I mentioned before, a loss scenario. Excuse me. That is basically split into two main elements. The first element is the loss magnitude. If that scenario manifests itself, what is the extent of the loss that we're going to incur? And there are several categories of losses, from direct replacement to compensation to competitive losses and marketing and legal fees and fines and so on and so forth. So it's very easy to kind of identify those different categories of losses. The other side of it is the threat, what we call the threat event frequency. Like how often is that loss event going to happen? And that side is kind of more mathematical in terms of statistical modeling. That takes into account who is the adversary, who is the threat actor, what is their accessibility, what is their capabilities to have an impact, to materialize a loss event on me as an organization. It also takes into account my capability to withstand a certain level of adversary. So there's kind of two competing levels of competence, one coming in from the adversary, how sophisticated or how capable they are, and from my end, do I have the right controls in place? What is my ability to detect, to reply, to detect, to respond, to mitigate an attack from a certain adversary? And using that model, baking in a kind of a statistical simulation around it, using Monte Carlo simulations, FAIR basically iterates thousands of times using those parameters with kind of a fuzzy logic, taking into account different confidence levels around the numbers that we're plugging in there, and coming up with a model that produces the loss expectancy, basically in terms of this is the number of times that we're expecting that this scenario will manifest itself into a loss scenario, and this is what is the loss magnitude associated with each and every one of those manifestations. So that's the high level of FAIR. Again, it's a big topic, and I highly encourage people to check out the Open FAIR website and learn more about it for sure.
So you're saying that, and I'm extrapolating here. You're saying that FAIR is an extension of 830 from NIST?
Oh, I heard that.
No, not necessarily.
No.
I think I believe that FAIR was actually created before the NIST
Was it?
model.
Yeah, Jack Jones created the FAIR model when he was at Nationwide Insurance back in late 90s. I mean, I've known Jack for years, right? We've actually had him on Enterprise Security Weekly. I'm trying to find the episode number. We actually interviewed Jack to talk about FAIR. I mean, he's the mastermind behind the FAIR model.
He's definitely the one to talk to about FAIR, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the Open Group supports FAIR as an open source model for others to use. We had Jim Haitala on from Open Group in our compliance roundtable at the end of last year. That's the Open Group that supports the FAIR model as well. So I'll find the episode number for people, but Jack is the expert on
the authority. Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting because the topic that you put forth that we have in our show notes where you mentioned quantifiable, I sort of jumped on that immediately thinking, why quantifiable over qualifiable? Which you explained right up front is basically assigning a dollar value. What I find interesting sort of in general in this discussion of different approaches to frameworks, or the quantifiable versus qualifiable, if you will, both seem to be, or neither are an exact science. One deals with dollars and cents more, one deals with more, shall I say, ethereal things like, likelihood of breach or hackers targeting you, things like that. At some point, it seems like what the takeaway is to me is know your audience. If you're trying to push something forward in your organization or for your customer, you've got a crowd that's going to understand, or an audience, if you will, that's going to understand dollars and cents, lean on the quantifiable. If you're talking more to the practitioners, perhaps you can get into more of the nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty of, this is how bad things are. This is what could happen. Agree, disagree?
Absolutely agree. I mean, I would first say that relying or kind of taking a framework as gospel is a big no-no. So take both would be my suggestion. And this is what I've been practicing in the past year here at Cimpress, is basically combining these two seemingly competing or completely different frameworks. One is the NIST CSF, the other one is FAIR, and using them in different ways. As you mentioned, one is much better from a tactical perspective. It provides you more coverage. If you're looking at 100 and something controls that NIST CSF covers, you can be much more confident that as a practitioner you're getting the full picture and examining the full scope of the defensive matrix. On the other hand, if you're looking at FAIR, you can be very confident that you're focused on the top level risks, that you can quantify them, that you can justify them. And by combining the two, you're getting the ability to kind of create a closed feedback loop. If you identify something in a loss scenario that you and your executive team are not comfortable assuming that level of risk, and you have a good mapping of the specific elements that drove that loss scenario to have a certain magnitude, and you can map those to NIST CSF scores, and you can say, you know what, this I can see what's the root cause of this problem, or I can see that if I up the score in 1, 2, 3, 5 areas of NIST CSF, it will have a material impact on my loss expectancy. And the cost of improving those elements might be from a resource perspective, might be from a purchasing, might be from a process perspective. It makes sense in terms of the expected reduction. That's, I think, where the magic really happens. It's in the kind of this weird fuzzy intersection between those two frameworks. And by the way, NIST and FAIR and Risklands have done a great job in also defining the mapping between NIST CSF and the FAIR framework. So there is an official NIST publication that talks about that mapping.
Interesting. Hey, you've sparked several questions in my mind, at least, and dare I say I might bring up those nasty 3 letters. But before we jump into that, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back and pick up the discussion from here.